Good day, everybody. Welcome to our monthly episode of Calmly Considered here at Faith Seeking Understanding University. I am Alan Bevere. I am the self-appointed Anselm of Canterbury, Chair of Podcast Theology and Culture at Faith Seeking Understanding University, where all seekers are welcome to ponder profound things free of charge. And my conversation partner, as always, is Michael Cruz, who has now joined the faculty of Faith Seeking Understanding University. He is the Grand Poobah Chair of Economics and Public Theology. So welcome to the faculty, Michael.
Well, thank you.
Now, as you know, there's no pay for this, but there's also no teaching responsibilities either. All you have to do is just have conversation with me once a month. And plus you get a great title, right?
Right.
The Grand Poobah Chair. You can, I was going to say you can put that on your resume, but I think both of us are at the age where we're not updating our resumes anymore.
All I need is a cool hat.
All you need is a cool hat. Well, you're welcome if you can find one you can wear it. Although, you know, obviously, we've there you go.
That might work, but you know, we'll have to expand it a little.
We'll have to figure that out. Yeah. I think that reveals that both of us probably as children watched the Flintstones growing up. But
yes,
I think but isn't that like Gilbert and Sullivan thing? Isn't Grand Poobah? Isn't that like the late 19th century?
I don't know where that comes from.
I think that's where it comes from. I'm gonna have to look it up now. I'm curious, but I think that's where it comes from. All right. Well, listen, it's good to see you. And, you know, I had you introduce yourself. But I just want to spend a couple of moments just letting folks know your background and your experience. And, you know, people who have followed me on this channel and blog and elsewhere probably know more about me than they want to. Right. But you've been very quick to say in our conversations, whether it's on video or you and I have private correspondence by email, you've been very quick to say you have not, you don't have a degree in economics or anything like that, but you very clearly know economics. I mean, there's no doubt about that. You've read widely in it, and so you've just kind of taught yourself on sociology and economics, haven't you?
Yeah, I mean, I do have graduate degrees in both sociology and in economic development. So I mean, I have.
Oh, economic development. Okay. Yeah. Well, you keep telling me you're not an economist. That's what it is.
Well, you get into things like macroeconomics and money supply and, you know, quantitative easing. My brain freezes over like everybody else's does.
Gotcha. I gotcha. I had a PhD in economics tell me that people that can't get PhDs in economics get MBAs. So
there you go.
I was at a conference in Oxford University about, it's got to be 12, 13 years now, where there were economists and MBAs there, and the tension was clear in the discussions. It was really interesting to watch the back and forth and the disagreements between the two. Okay, that's neither here nor there. You also have spent time in the area of public theology. So tell us what public theology is.
Well, public theology I think of as being, how does the Christian faith relate to broader society? How does it relate to the issues that are happening in the culture? And so more than just personal piety or biblical studies, that type of thing. This is, how does theology relate to the broader issues in society? That's how I typically think of it.
Have you read on that in any Miroslav Volf?
Yes.
Okay, because he talks a lot about public. We should make that an episode one time. What's public theology and why is it important? Yeah. And the reason as I say that is because, you know, a mutual friend of ours, Scott McKnight, talks about kingdom and the difference between kingdom work and good work and all of that. And it has caused a little bit of controversy over that. It might be a good idea to just have that conversation one time.
Yeah, so should. Yeah. It's
You've also worked for profits and nonprofit firms. Yeah. So you know both of those worlds, and you have served in the Presbyterian Church. for 25 years at all levels. So you are embedded with the Presbyterians. You are a Presbyterian.
Yeah, right.
Okay.
Yeah, I served congregational sessions. I've served presbytery. I've had some responsibilities at the Synod. I was chair of the Presbyterian Mission Agency Board for a while. So yeah, been through the whole levels of Presbyterianism. Yeah.
Okay. Well, and you and I are proof that friendships can take place across denominational lines.
There you go. That's right.
I had somebody say to me one time, you're in another church, we were going to do something in partnership with a Presbyterian church. And a church member came up to me after service because we had made the announcement. And they said to me, but Pastor, they're Presbyterians. I said, yes, I noticed that. All right, so we need to get on. Everybody, I'm sure, is tired of our small talk. So today, we're asking the question, and I'm going to ask the question this way because I'm not going to presume a conclusion yet, but does the church fail business people? And this is the book that's going to launch our discussion by John Knapp, How the Church Fails Business People. This was a book you recommended to me, Michael. And as you can see by my marks, I've read through it and I got more questions and thoughts than we've got time. Right. But boy, what a great read. And I want to say right now that, first of all, I would recommend any pastor read this book. Because almost all of us who have been pastored, or pastored churches, all of us have had business people in our congregations. I've been blessed in every church I've served to have had business people. And this is just a great read.
Yeah.
And the other thing that I would recommend that Christian business people read the book.
Yeah.
And so you and I, one of the things, this is how I want to start our conversation. You and I have both had the same experience of at times listening to a sermon. And so, since I preach, I don't get to hear too many, but I go to our annual conference meetings and I listen to our general conferences. And we have these moments where some preacher makes some kind of sweeping claim about business.
Right.
And I cringe, right? Because look, I'm a pastor, I don't understand the ins and outs of all business. I know a little bit. I think I can work my way around the room, but I don't know all this stuff that business people, what makes for a good business and all of that. But it's important. It's important to have this conversation. So why, in what way do you think the church at times fails business people? Now here, I think we're specifically talking about Christians who are in business. Right. Right. Yeah. And I don't want to ignore people who have other faith commitments in business, but specifically we're focusing on, the business people who sit in my pews on Sunday morning, sit in the pews where you go to church. How does the church fail business people?
Well, yeah. And I just want to preface the conversation. It may sound like at times when I'm talking that I'm putting all the onus on the church or on pastors is the problem. And it isn't. It's a systemic codependent failure.
It's a codependent relationship. Yes.
Yes. What's at the end of Annie Hall, Woody Allen has the thing about, he says, Doc, he's talking to a psychiatrist. He says, you got to help me. I got this friend who thinks he's a chicken. And he says, well, have you told him he isn't a chicken? No, because I need the eggs. With this topic, it often feels that way to some degree.
Yeah.
Pastors, I think, often are reticent or conflicted about what to say about business and some of these issues. And the other side of that is I've seen this over and over again. It's come up in many conversations where church members, a controversial topic is being broached in the congregation, and church members will say, "Why do we have to talk about all this? Church is my refuge to get away from all this stuff.
Yes,
I have to deal with at work and TV and all that type of stuff. And I come here to get away from it. Now you just want to bring it here to church and talk about all that." So there's this divide between two worlds, the world of the church and the world of business. and trying to figure out how to have that conversation. Pastors, many pastors have what I'm going to say, they benefit by not getting into that because it causes controversy for them. And the church members benefit from that because they don't have to think about it. This is they just compartment their life, and you live one thing over here and the other over there. I don't think that's true of everybody. I think at the core of who most of us are, we want our lives to be integrated. We want to feel whole. We want to feel that our whole lives are meaningful and that they are together. I think it's interesting. Knapp talks about having his students go out and they interview 230 people from all walks of life. And they have 5 questions. It's a, what do you call it? Interview type thing that they do with business people. So they interview 230 people. And I think one of the things they asked them to do is to imagine a difficult situation that you've had in business at some point in your life. Did you seek out your pastor or some other spiritual leader for advice on what to do about that issue? Can you think of an issue like that? Out of 230 people, these are people range from U.S. senators to people who work cleaning people in hotels and all sorts of gradations of jobs in between. 230 people, 18 said that they had, and at least 9 or 10 of those did because they were thinking about switching jobs from one job to another, which meant, a handful of people had ever sought out a spiritual leader for a tough ethical question that they had in their business life. And it just shows you how divided our spirituality often is from business. And so I think that's why I think this is important. I know some people will read this book and say how the church fails business people, and what they think they may be reading between the lines as well. The church should be, so you're saying the church should just be affirming business people for who they are and get on the bandwagon and cheer them on and all that kind of, not exactly. The issue is how do we integrate business into our faith? And the church generally has not done a good job of that.
Yeah, and I can say that of all the business people I have the privilege of serving as their pastor, every one of them has wanted to put their faith into practice in their business.
Right.
There's nobody who has thought that their faith somehow is separated off, although that does happen, right?
Sure.
I mean, the book points that out. So, one of the interesting dilemmas, so the 2 things. The first is there's a real generational difference here in reference to what you discuss in church, because those of us who come from the boomer older generation, and I'm born right on the line between boomer and Gen X, and so having a ambiguous identity really fits me well anyway. But for those of us who are older, we didn't talk about these things in church, whether it was politics or business or, anything controversial. But the younger folks, the millennials, Generation Z, these folks, this is one of their complaints about the church, is that, we want to think about these things. We want to think about these things in reference to our faith. We don't want to be told what to think, but we want to talk about it because, by the way, somehow our faith should matter for it.
Right.
And so, and I see this, by the way, I see this in my congregation because I've got a couple of coworkers who are, one is mid-20s, one is 30, and they just think it makes perfect sense. So we need to talk about sexuality in church. We need to talk about immigration. We need to talk about all these things. And and so we have tried to host what you have called courageous conversations. We did one on race about a year ago, and I'm going to do one in winter on immigration, where we bring people together in conversation for that. But there are people in the church who will not take it because they're like what you said. I go to church to get away from it all. Right. Whereas I continue to insist that when the church gathers together, this is not where church. We don't gather together to get away from it all. We gather together to attempt to make sense of it all, right? And so we have to have these conversations.
Right.
This is tough, but this is tough for pastors because pastors, in many ways, we walk a fine line on these controversial issues. We've got people with different understandings of politics. We have people who come from labor, others come from management.
Yeah.
You know, I've had a superintendent in my school and same teachers, and there's all kinds of stuff. So
yeah,
it's really kind of easy for us to just actually get away from it all and ignore it, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, and I think the thing, this actually taps into a broader issue for me in general when you think about economics and those broader issues, but particularly with business and work. What, other than our family life and what we do in our homes, in our neighborhoods, what do we spend the majority of our hours of each day, each weekday anyway, doing? We're at work. That's what we do. And so that's where people are spending their lives. That's where their faith meets the world in many times in the most significant ways. Knapp points out in his book, and I met Knapp actually. We've had several conversations. I really enjoyed talking with him. But just talking about doing research on seminaries, he went down through course listings for seminaries, and I forget how many he went through, all from mainline evangelical seminaries across the board. And he found, maybe a handful of seminaries, like 2 or 3 classes in a couple seminaries that talked about the issues of work and faith. But every one of them has multiple classes about family and family dynamics and family counseling and, all these kind of things. And it's not that those aren't important, but it's just that the other, it just seems invisible in the life of the church.
Yeah.
It's not. I don't think most people, when you talk to them and ask them the liturgy that occurs during the church, the corporate prayer, things that get prayed for, and the pastoral prayers, or things that people lift up prayers for, almost never seems to touch on the issues of business and work life.
Yeah.
And to the degree it does, it's usually very peripheral. And the message that just seems to get communicated through the whole ethos is that business is over here. That's one segment of my life, and church is what I do over here. And so, yeah.
Don't you think a big part of that is the fact that the church in the West has just been, and I'm going to use the word infested with Western hyper-individualism.
Right.
And we take that into our faith. So my faith is about me.
Right.
And at the most outside of me, it's about my family, right? Because that's important. But we have so individualized the faith that the larger issues, I'll call them social corporate issues, just are not on the radar. By the way, you see this now, and I think you and I actually talked about this, with everything going on right now with the racial tensions in our society. And of course, the Bible, which I believe speaks to these issues, you've got some pastors who are saying, well, the Bible doesn't address systemic issues. It doesn't address corporate. It addresses the individual life and the soul and salvation, which of course is only partly true. It does address the latter, but it also addresses the former. But that's the individualism of our culture. So it's very easy then for us to compartmentalize business, politics. It's easy to compartmentalize these things and focus on my faith as my faith.
Right. Yeah. Well, and I think another piece to this too, in terms of what's happening in the culture, there's the individualism aspect of this.
Yeah.
But you talk about trying to integrate economics and faith. And the two streams that I tend to see when I look at this, where conversations about economics and faith happen, in a lot of the conservative churches that I have been around, and I listen to their speakers and read the stuff they write, there tends to be almost this blanket baptism of American capitalism and business and that type of stuff. And you have the guy who's the local bigwig in town with the great business. And he's the person we're going to have speak on Sunday because he's such a dynamic Christian person. Well, the guy may have no Christian groundings and maybe a great business person, a nice guy, but really has no theological grounding and so on. And yet, because he's a good business person, we lift these people up as role models for what it means to be like Christ. And often there's not a lot there. And so there's, on the one hand, there's this sense of just sort of baptizing the culture of American Christianity. On the other side, in more progressive churches, which is what you tend to find more Presbyterian Church USA, and a lot of Methodist churches, there is just sort of this ethereal blanket distrust of all things business and capitalism. It's all evil, it's all exploitive, and you're participating in evil systems if you're part of business, but go ahead and come to church and give us our tithe. And the way you can redeem yourself is by serving on our church boards and helping us with our programming and projects we're doing here. Right. But from the pulpit, largely all you're going to hear is condemnation. And I'll just share this one brief story with you that I thought was interesting. I was talking with this has been a few years ago, but I was talking with a pastor who had been a solo pastor of a fairly good sized Presbyterian church for 25 years, very progressive guy, very progressive in his politics. And we were talking about this very topic. And he says, well, I got a little confession for you. He says, I'm one of those guys who stood up in the pulpit, preached every Sunday. And, I occasionally would rail against capitalism and, the evils of business and consumerism and all this stuff. And he says, and then after he left this church, he went to work as associate pastor at a large mega church and had a more specialized thing there. And he said, one day he was walking past a group of men from the church that were having a Bible study together. And they're all business people. It was a little business group. And one of them was talking to the others, and he was saying, look, he says, my company is supposed to be, we are exporting this project. We want to export to Nigeria. And we can because there's a really good market there for what we're doing. We'd like to get into that market. And our competitors are getting in that market. But they want bribes for everything that we're doing in order to try to get this product in there. And my faith tells me that you can't pay bribes, that's not legitimate. What would you guys do in this? So then they begin having this conversation. And he says it was that moment as he's walking by, just overhearing this conversation, he realized that all these years there's been these people sitting in his congregation who are legitimately struggling, trying to figure out how to reconcile these various things in their faith and business. And he had never provided a forum or a venue where he could bring his theological knowledge, his biblical study, in order to help people try to process those kind of issues. Instead, he just stayed at this very ethereal, sort of holier than thou, kind of perspective in terms of his preaching. And so I think that to me was interesting to hear him give that testimony about, what was going on. Yeah.
Yeah, I've said often online trusts and pastors will condemn business across the board, but they'll be right there when they need a big gift for their building addition.
Exactly. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And so it isn't that simple. It isn't. You and by the way, when it comes to, and I don't want to get back on socialism versus capitalism. We had that discussion a couple of months ago, but the reality is if you study any government, any nation, currently or past, ones that are the most laissez-faire you can find and one that are the most socialist you can find, and somewhere in between, every single one of them has wealthy people and every single one of them has poor people. Right. So when people hold up this whole system, right, as being the antidote, my answer is I haven't seen it yet.
Yeah.
And so you have to get to deeper issues of ethics and of character and of what's right and doing the right thing.
Right. Yeah. Sure. Yeah.
He talks about the necessity of a Christian ethic. Yeah. And this was interesting. He says, this is on page 14, but he says, most major corporations had no ethics codes as recently as 1990.
Yeah.
Nearly all of them have them today. What changed?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think there has been a big effort in business schools. I don't know the history enough of that to know exactly what prompted that. I got my MBA in late 80s, but of course this was at a Christian institution. Yeah. And our our MBA class was more than just the MBA classes. There were also theology classes that were added to that MBA and others as well. So Christian ethics was a very big, obviously part of my education. But yes, I think that was very much the exception at that time. But I don't know. I don't have a good sense of what might have sparked that.
Yeah, I don't know it either. I'm almost half tempted off the top of my head to say it probably because of lawsuits.
Yeah.
You know, you start making rules, you start doing, many years ago, our conference, and this was back, this was early 90s. We started requiring clergy to attend a sexual ethics seminar once every 2 or 3 years. And that only started because we had a lawsuit in the conference. So, as I used to say, it was the conference covering their butts by telling us to cover our fronts, right? So if the conference gets sued, they say negligent hiring. They say, hey, wait a minute, we had the seminar, we went through this training, right? So that's probably why. Here's another thing. He says on page 16, and it's an obvious observation, but sometimes, in certain contexts, obvious observations can be the most profound, right?
Yeah.
It's at the bottom of the page. We turn to our theology, not law or economics, with the big questions about who we are and how we ought to relate to others and the world we inhabit. Michael, do we do that? I don't know that we do that.
That's what we're supposed to do.
That's what we're supposed to do. Yeah. But I don't know that we do that. I was just saying. I was saying to another pastor this morning, a friend of mine. We meet on Tuesdays to talk about lectionary texts for Sunday. And I said to him, what has, in this whole period of COVID, what has just really surprised me and disappointed me is how Christians I know, who I'm sure are faithful, and I know they're faithful, and everything that I can see, they're faithful, and so I'm not doubting their faithfulness. But how many of them, in responding to this time of COVID, there's just no sense of the great commandment, loving neighbor.
Yeah, right.
To respond in such a way that whatever I do, I need to act in such a way to fulfill what Jesus says is one of the 2 great commandments, loving my neighbor. Do we really, for the big things in life, go to faith? And go to our theology. I have serious doubts about that.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's an interesting question when somebody is getting acquainted with somebody else that they've just met. What's one of the first questions they ask them? What do you do?
What do you do? Yeah.
So your first thing, one of the key identifiers that we use to size up other people is what their occupation is, what their job is.
Right.
And so, obviously that's at the center of our identity. And I think that begins to, if that's at the center of who you are and what's driving things are going to get distorted and twisted.
Yeah.
I think what you're getting at to me, and this actually comes back up to the 30,000, 50,000 foot level again out of this topic and applies to so many others, is that we don't seem to have what I would call an all-inclusive narrative of what God is doing in the world that ties in our work and the various aspects of our life together into a cohesive narrative. And it goes back to some of this I was just talking about before. Church is a refuge. Church is an escape from the world, which is over there. And I come over here to get recharged and get my batteries to go back out over there so that I can live that and keep coming back, rather than seeing that I am an ambassador, that the church is kind of like the embassy, and we are being sent from that embassy as ambassadors into the daily lives that we live each day in order to be ambassadors. And so what does it mean to represent the embassy, to represent this other kingdom in our particular daily lives? I don't think most people have that perspective. That's what they're, or if they may have an intellectual assent to that they understand that, but it does not penetrate and fill them in terms of the warp and woof of who they are and how they think.
Yeah.
So I think at some level that is where we have a big issue in the church, and we tend to just latch on. I was getting at this earlier. It's another way of saying the same thing. I think in a lot of conservative churches, we bought into this white nationalism thing of America and America first and America is great. And so that's not Christian. It's just, we're latching onto what's in the culture. And other parts of the church, it's what defines us is our progressive commitment and to creating a more progressive world. And so all of our liturgy, all of our activities, our programming is all oriented towards advancing this sort of progressive agenda type thing that we've got that we want to advance. But there's no core inclusive picture that pulls it all together.
Right.
So, yeah, I don't know if I'm being clear, but that's...
You're being very clear. Doesn't that go back to the notion of vocation? That the belief that God doesn't just call people like me to be a pastor or other people to be missionaries, but that God can call us to be teachers. God can call us to be in business and provide service. God can call us to be, whatever it might be. I mean, I tell you what, I love a good God. I've said before, I've said throughout my life that it's such a blessing to have a God-inspired auto mechanic.
Right. Yeah.
Because first of all, they're honest, right?
Right. Yeah.
And so we've lost that sense of vocation. So, I wonder how many, and I'm sure there are some. Are there any Christian business persons who think to themselves, God called me to do this?
Yeah, I think there are, and I think a lot of people have very much a strong sense that this is they're fulfilling some sort of a deeper calling in their life. I do want to be careful there, though, because I think the majority of people probably don't have that feeling.
Yeah.
In the sense of that their occupation is something that truly fulfills them and fulfills some sort of great gift that God's given them to do this particular thing. And that type of work is good. It's okay.
Yes.
That the idea that your work may not be particularly meaningful. Sometimes work has instrumental value that you have to do. And there are other ways in which you may exhibit some of those gifts that God has given you in context at work or in family or church that are not going to play out in your occupation. There's work that has to be done, that somebody has to do, and not all of us are in those real happy situations. I've always been a bit troubled by that what was the thing about find what the world's deepest need is and what your deepest passion is and match the two up. Well, that's really great and works for probably about 1 or 2% of the population.
Right. Well, exactly. And so, for some people, their work is to put food on the table for their families. I mean,
exactly.
That can certainly be seen as what a Christian does, right? Being responsible, right? Yeah. So we can overdo the vocation thing in some ways, is what I'm hearing you say.
Yeah, right. I go back to the whole thing of from Genesis to Revelation. I mean, the whole story of Genesis 1 is the idea that man and woman are put there as the image of God. They're the ones who are the vice regents over creation. You see evidence of that through scripture at various points. And the whole thing begins in the garden. And at the end, it ends up with the city in a garden. With the tree of life by the river there. And we will reign again. And the idea of reigning over creation and all of the glory of humanity from the various nations is brought into that heavenly city. And so there's a sense in which what we're doing now somehow matters to this future vision that God is creating in the new world, that these things are being built. And we are a part of that we are co-creators. We are vice regents with God in creation and bringing about the goodness in the world that God intends for the world to have. And I don't think most of us experience that's.
Yeah, as I recall, I want to say Pope John Paul II actually published an encyclical on that, of being co-laborers, co-creators.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And that we are, and theologically, creation is still happening. I mean, I think obviously that's true scientifically.
Right.
The universe is expanding, but there is something about the fact that we continue, that creation is not a static thing, which you can, by the way, get from the Genesis account if you read it too literally. But one of the other things that just occurs to me as you're talking about Genesis and Revelation is Sabbath is a time to recreate, and it is a way also to be reminded that our identity is not found solely in what we do, right? Because one day a week we are to take we're to take the day off. We don't treat it legalistically like some of the Pharisees, that the issue is just not do anything. No, the issue is to recreate. The issue is to be reminded of what's at the center, because work takes a lot of time, and if we're not careful, it can, and this someone's going to accuse me of being Marxist here, but it can alienate us. It can alienate us from what's really important. And I think building Sabbath. So, I mean, it just reinforces what you were saying. We don't want to. Vocation is important, but we don't want to go all out on it, because what happens then to Sabbath?
Yeah, right, exactly. And the temptation then is that you create vocation as an idol.
Yes.
Your identity is what you do. Well, that's not true. That's not true.
It isn't true.
What you do is important. It's an act of service to God. It's a rendering of something to God, but it is not the thing itself. And I think that
right.
So on the one hand, we just sort of seem indifferent and ignore the issue of vocation in people's daily lives, which leads to two extremes. One is the idolization of their economic life, their work, and just making that the center of everything they do, or it leaves them feeling very dissatisfied and lost and without direction, because they can't figure out what's supposed to give meaning to their life. Yeah, it's so somehow figuring out that larger narrative. How does our work life integrate with the rest of our spirituality? I thought at the end of the book he sort of gave 4 suggestions of things that we should pursue in terms of the church, which I thought were pretty good. I thought,
well, why don't we take a look at that then, and go through that. Help me out.
It was collaborative leadership was the first thing I saw at the end of the book there in that last chapter. I'm not sure what page that starts on.
Chapter 8.
Yeah, chapter 8. He says, where is this? Yeah, starts on page 150.
So let's take those.
Yeah.
Collaborative leadership, courageous conversations, relevant worship, and a more inclusive narrative. So let's take them in turn, Michael. Collaborative leadership. What leaders are collaborating here that he has in mind?
I think you're talking about pastors, the people that are spiritual leaders, and you're talking about business people walking together to figure this out. Pastors often don't have the, many of them, some have, but most of them don't have the experience of having worked in the business world. It's not first nature to them in terms of how all this works. Business people are not studied in scripture. They don't have the biblical studies, the theology background, all that type of thing, to the resources necessarily that they all need. And so to figure this difficult question out is going to require people walking side by side to try to figure out what this is. It can't just be a top-down program where we're going to train business people to be the right type of people, or business people, which too often happens the other direction, just going off by themselves, being their own group within the church, disconnected from the congregation, but getting together and supporting each other. So,
yeah, I have a good friend for many years he just retired, but he was a minority owner in a business for many years, spent his life in business, really attempts to bring his faith into his business practices. And when the meltdown hit in 2008, and he and I, we get together every 2-3 months and we meet halfway, have lunch. And he was going through a lot of struggles because they were going to have to lay people off. The headquarters is here in Ohio, but there was a factory, I want to say, down in Florida. And so I can remember just spending our lunchtime together, him just talking and struggling, and me doing my best to give him a little bit of wisdom as I could. Right. But one of the things that so impressed me about him was that when they made the decision to close that factory in Florida, he flew down there personally.
Right.
And he met with everybody that worked there and told them what was going on, talked it through with them, told them that, they would work on giving them as much as they could, severance package, blah, 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 blah. But he wasn't content just to send out the email, right? You have these stories about, you go to work and everybody has an email that says, oh, we're closed today, right? We're closing down for good. He wasn't content to do that. He wanted, because these are human, for him, these are human beings. They're supporting their families. And he wanted to share in what was going to be bad news for them.
Yeah.
And I just hugely admired that.
Right.
And it was because I know him and I know his Christian convictions.
Right.
And these weren't just people who were feeding his bottom line and no longer could, and so now they were dispensable. These are human beings. And you talk about the image of God in creation. I mean, to me, that was just, I've never forgotten that.
Right.
But I also think about the fact, and I don't know, that maybe in some way our collaboration hopefully helped him think through some of those things.
Right.
And wouldn't it be great if we could have that kind of collaboration on a regular basis between business leaders and, say, pastors in the community or lay people who've really thought about these things.
Right. And so the question is, so what's the formula for doing? Well, there is no formula.
Yeah.
Just start trying.
There's no formula. And thank God, because I was lost in formulas when I was in math. So
yeah.
It's really good. So yes, and collaboration, Michael, in anything, there is just nothing better than leading by collaboration. I collaborate all the time in our congregation.
Yeah.
And there are certain things that by our book of discipline, I have charge of.
Right.
If I decide tomorrow I want to change the worship time, I can do it.
Right.
But I'm not going to do it.
Yeah.
If I feel like we need to think about that, we're going to collaborate.
Right.
And so collaboration is just critical. So I just appreciate that. Okay, the next one, courageous conversations. Yeah. He says real change comes grudgingly to any established organization. I don't think he has to prove that, does it? But this is especially true of churches. He doesn't have to prove that either. He says it is easy enough to tweak existing programs or add an occasional Sunday school lesson, sermon, or guest speaker, but cultural transformation must begin with honest dialogue about the extent to which the church helps Christians connect faith and work. So courageous conversations.
Yeah. And I think it ties in with the collaborative leadership issue as well. It's just simply being able to develop the trust where people can be honest about what they're experiencing and what they're feeling, and knowing that you're going to disagree. I mean, you talked about having church superintendents. Let me see if I can get that out of there. Sorry, I had a phone call trying to come in.
Sorry.
Yeah, if you have people trying to have difficult conversations in spaces, there has to be a level of trust that exists. I think I was telling you about one of our previous conversations about a pastor friend who said that a businessman came to him and was telling him he was going to buy I think it was Aaron Rent's. I think I misnamed the business last time we were talking about. I think it was the Aaron Rent's franchise, which tends to charge exorbitant interest and prices to people that are trying to rent furniture, that type of thing. Pastor had some questions about getting into this business model, but the guy bought a couple of franchises and comes back several months later and is talking to the pastor. And he says, I'm starting to have some ethical questions about how this whole business model works and whether this is the right thing to do or not. And the pastor says, well, when you told me you were getting that franchise, I was kind of, questioning that myself. And so the guy will say, well, why didn't you say something?
Yeah.
Why didn't you, challenge me, ask the question? Well, because he didn't want to offend. He didn't want to, you've got to have the place where you can have those courageous conversations to be honest with each other and to say, we may end up disagreeing about the topic and we're still going to walk together and keep pursuing these issues. So that's the collaborative leadership along with the courageous conversations, I think, is probably key to figuring out a way forward.
So you have to have two things for a courageous conversation. The first is you got to have the courage. So people have to be willing to do that. And the second thing, of course, is trust, because it's true.
Yeah.
You and I both know that we will listen to something we probably disagree with if we're listening to someone we trust.
Right.
As opposed to someone we either distrust or we don't even know. Right. So, and that takes building relationship, and that takes time. The reality is just because you got the title pastor or reverend or whatever it is, doesn't automatically mean you get respect.
Right.
And so, and I think there are people, and there are people, and there's other professions too like this, where, some people think because you've got a title or you've got certain letters after your name, that somehow that should automatically command respect. But that just isn't the way it works.
Right. Yeah. Right.
So,
and as a business person, you may think you've got it all figured out. You've got the theology behind this, and sometimes you need to be a little more teachable. Just listen to what's being said and realize there may be alternative ways of looking at the issues that you're dealing with.
Yeah.
So, I think those are two of the key
things that I have done over the years, Michael, and I have to say I haven't done it with every single person, but I should have. But that I will, if I got someone in my church who's in, and they don't say I have to be in business, they may teach at a university somewhere or whatever it is. I'll say to them, do you mind if one day at your convenience, I come to your place for an hour or two and show me around and let me see what you do? I'd like to know. And I've never had anyone turn me down. In fact, I've had people pretty happy to, show to me what's important to them. Right. But what that does is it does two things. First of all, it makes a connection. But secondly, it tells them, which is what is true, and that is I'm interested in what they do and I'm interested in their life. Right. And I think if you do that, then when you have to have those courageous conversations, it's easier.
Right. Yeah. That's an excellent point. I think one of the interesting things is, as Nat points out in his book, he taught at Columbia Seminary down in Georgia, and he talked about that with the MDiv students, that one of the assignments he had for his class was that they had to go out and interview 3 people in business in their business setting and to learn about their business. Students are very reluctant to do this. They what's the point of this? And that's an awkward situation, that type of thing. And he talks almost to a student that after they had gone out and done those interviews, it totally changed their whole perspective on ministry and what they were to do and what they're to be about. Yeah. It suddenly gave them a much more full-orbed view of what ministry needs to be about. That just that occasionally taking that time of getting acquainted with what it is that people actually do, and even if not possible with every occupation, but to spend time in the workplace with people to find out what they're doing that's a big trust builder right there, and really gives you insight that the pastor really has got some perspective on what you're doing.
Exactly right. Yeah. Okay, very good. He also talks about relevant worship. Now, I like worship. When relevant. I mean, I always have to say this is the Karl Barth coming out in me, but I just I get nervous when I hear the word relevant, because it says to me that worship in and of itself is not relevant. There's something I got to do to make it that way. It's the same way with making the gospel relevant. No, the gospel is relevant. It's already relevant.
Right.
I don't have to do anything to make it that way. So I have to confess my radar goes up a little bit.
Yeah.
But I don't think that's really what he's talking about, is it?
No, I think what he's simply doing here is that we have had a strong tendency to overlook and not see the work of daily life in people's lives. And in our liturgies, that aspect of our existence should be reflected in the liturgies. It's certainly reflected in Scripture. And so we tend to overlook that aspect of things. One of the things I think is interesting is that if you talk about going to have a mission group that's going to go to Guatemala or Haiti or something like that, we'll have a commissioning service to send people to go on those events. We have somebody they're going to teach Christian education classes in the Christian education program. We'll have a commissioning service for them to teach those Christian education classes. But where have you ever seen a commissioning service for people to go do the work that they're doing in their lives, which is what occupies the great majority of people's times? Is there any way in which we put our hands on people and bless them and send them into the world to do the work that they're doing in their daily lives? I don't think most people have the sense of that kind of call to it. And so in that sense, I think that's what he's sort of getting at, in my understanding of relevant worship, is that it's not so much trying to add on or make it feel relevant to people as it is that there is a neglected part of our theology, a neglected part of our public theology that needs to be recovered.
Yeah, and I agree with him on that. And I do think it's important that we try and find ways to reconcile that.
Yeah.
He also talks about a more inclusive narrative.
Yeah.
And he talks about the church's story itself, which is interesting. And every church has a story. I'm not so sure congregations and pastors, to be honest. I don't think we think about that too often. I think the most we get is when we think about who we are, we'll say we're friendly, right?
Yeah.
That's usually the number one thing. But he says, what is the church's story of itself? Who are central to the narrative? And then he says, this is great. This is really great. For a simple test, visit the websites of a few churches and notice the images describing the congregations and their priorities. You'll likely find many depictions of worship, youth activities, service projects, clergy, and perhaps a foreign missionary or two. Seldomly you see photographs or other descriptions of church members in their weekday work. Too often we reduce the church's rich story to a collection of programs, inevitably dampening the vitality of a community of believers serving through Christ in their everyday living.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
I was at a church probably 4 or 5 years ago. I thought was interesting. They had these giant bulletin boards that were on wheels. They had like 3 or 4 of them out in their big foyer area.
Mm-hmm.
And what they had done is they had invited church members to take a little selfie of themselves, and then they would post the picture up there like on a little 3x5 index card type thing. And then they talk about to where they are called in terms of work. And each member put the picture up there. They put down what their occupation was, and then they could write any notes that they wanted to, or any ways that they wish to be prayed for in terms of their work. And there were like 350 people that had put their little postcards up there, just saying, this is who I am, and this is the place where God has called me right now. This is what I'm doing. And you walk into that church, that's the first thing that greets you when you walk in the door there, along with all the other stuff, the churchy stuff that we normally see. And it really sort of gave you a impression that this is a focus. This is this group values that type of service in the world. So one of the things I did as a little exercise, I don't know if I could find it again, but about 8 or 9 years ago, I wrote a commissioning service, this sort of a blanket commissioning service, a liturgy that you could use for blessing the congregation for people for their work lives. That was just, it was more of an experiment from my standpoint to see what I could come up with. But anyway, those are just interesting little things of thinking about how do we increase this inclusive narrative that includes the idea of vocation and making it more prominent in what our thinking is. Because I think most people, like you said, very individualistic. We tend to think in terms of just our personal lives and not how we are ambassadors sent to the work world, or on the idea that we're there to fight for justice and to correct wrongs. But it doesn't seem to fit into a larger narrative of what we're doing in our work lives. Neither of those really seem to address it. Yeah.
Okay, well, we're getting to time, but I want to end with, on page 156, it's the last page of the book, there's a question asked, and I'm going to ask you the question.
Yeah.
How might your local church begin to explore new avenues of ministry to connect the worlds of faith in work, and who would be involved? If you were on the ground up of this, so your pastor comes to you and say, I want to start this. What would you say?
I think you start this the way you do most things that end up going successfully. You find 2 or 3 people that also share a common passion and vision. You have conversation with them, and then you begin to develop a perspective, a view of where to go with that for the future, and then figure out how you can add 2 or 3 more. And then as that develops, then you figure out how you can add 2 or 3 more beyond that. The idea of developing a snowball effect.
Okay.
I think the temptation with a lot of church situations is, well, let's create a program and let's bring everybody from point A to point B in one big movement.
Yeah.
And I really think that the way is to begin. And when I say that, I should also qualify that I think what often happens is that a business person, which is often where a lot of this energy comes from to pursue these issues, business person gets excited about this. They tend to be Lone Ranger, go off, find 2 or 3 other business people. They exclude their congregation. They exclude the pastor from the conversation, and they begin to get this thing going. And so it starts taking off as this own little cell that's apart from the life of the rest of the church.
Right.
It's a very tempting thing, because that way you don't have to deal with that difficult pastor who doesn't understand all this stuff in the first place. So we all know what we're doing, so let's go create this thing.
Yeah.
And that's one side. The other side for a pastor, I think, sometime would be to try to create a big program for all the business people to come together and do this thing. I don't think either of those is a good way to start. I think you find 2 or 3 people, disciple them, and begin to grow from there. That's my thoughts.
Yeah, sounds good. I like it. Well, my goodness, good conversation.
Yeah.
Friends, I'm going to put the Amazon link to this book, How the Church Fails Business People, on the YouTube site and the YouTube channel, on the podcast channel, and on my blog. And so if you are interested, so let me say, pastors, I recommend this book highly. And if you're listening and you're a Christian in business, I think also this is a good read. I think it's a good read for anybody. It's Michael, I was thinking, it's not a difficult read, but it's a substantive read. So the best books are always, in my opinion, substantive, and also you're able to understand it.
Yes. Nat did a very good job with this. It's one of the better written books I've read. I mean,
and so it's really great. All right, Michael Cruz. So we're going to close this out. So Michael Cruz, my friend, the Grand Poobah Chair of Economics and Public Theology at Faith Seeking Understanding University, who does a great job of informing us on these matters. And I'm Alan Bevere. I am the self-appointed Anselm of Canterbury Chair of Podcast Theology and Culture. And it's Anselm who is the patron saint of Faith Seeking Understanding University, who said, I do not seek to understand that I may believe, but I believe in order to understand. So have a good day, friends, and keep seeking.
All right. See you soon.
See you soon.